Is Jimbo Fisher on the hot seat? Does a win at Georgia stand between Auburn and a berth in the college football playoff? And I preview the Week 2 matchups for the college pick'em season. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
And a personal foul on number 99 of the defense. After he tackled the quarterback, he's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Well, hey everyone, I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review, and this is the Friday show. We have a lot to talk about before we dive into Week 5 of the college football season. It's going to be an exciting weekend. There's a lot of good games, a lot on the slate that we have to get to. But I want to start off today's show going into a discussion a little bit about Jimbo Fisher, and obviously now he's in his third season at the helm of Texas A&M, and they have Alabama this weekend. And it's at Bryant-Denny, and it's going to be a really tough matchup for Fisher and the Aggies. Now, look, obviously we just mentioned it, right? He's in his third season. He has a third-year starting quarterback. Pretty loaded defense with a lot of depth, a lot of talent. So it's pretty easy for someone to sit there and, if you don't look at it too closely, say, oh, well, A&M seems like a pretty legit contender, especially in the West, because we all know that LSU is significantly dropped off. Alabama had some issues last season and this season too, which we'll get into a little bit later in the show. But right now A&M looks like a pretty solid dark horse pick in the West. And then you look at what they did against Vanderbilt. You look at the 7-5 lead they took into the locker room. And, even the final score of that game, which there's been a lot of talk about A&M and what would happen once Jimbo Fisher took over. And that really has not panned out for them. It really hasn't. A 17-12 win over Vandy at home in your season opener is not really how you want to start out your third year of your, what was it? It was like 10 million, or it was not 10-year, $75 million contract, I believe was his. The contract with Jimbo Fisher. But regardless, right? All that seems to kind of be on the line, in this matchup against Alabama. Now, do I think that A&M's going to fire Jimbo Fisher if he loses to Alabama on the road? No. Nobody's really expecting A&M to win this game. I think it really will be interesting to see how long A&M competes in this matchup. Because here's the deal, right? A&M not only has Alabama, but they also have Florida coming up in the next 2 weeks. So, we can probably say with a lot of certainty that they're going to lose in Tuscaloosa on Saturday, and then we need to figure out, how do they salvage their season? How do they, moving forward, right, and even, going into that Florida matchup, like, if they drop both of those, what is there left to play for in terms of, not even the SEC championship, just a bowl game at that point? Because, again, A&M right now is a team that seems to be a perennial Tier 2 SEC team, a team that's not a cellar dweller like South Carolina or Arkansas or Vanderbilt. But the teams like Mississippi State and maybe an Ole Miss, especially in the West, are starting to close that gap. They're starting to close that gap. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a little bit of ire come out of College Station if Jimbo Fisher drops the Alabama game and the Florida game and it's ugly. Right? If A&M goes in and they get beat by 35 points and then they turn around and lose to Florida by a significant margin, it's really not going to look good. It's not going to look good at all for the Aggies. And again, you have to start questioning, okay, well, what do you do here going forward? Because, in 3 years, you really haven't been able to make any sort of case that you, as a team, as a program, belong in the discussion of being at the top of the West. I mean, again, right now, in the West alone, you have Alabama, who will always be a threat of some kind, even though this year they seem to still have some they had a lot of issues, especially on offense against Missouri. But again, we'll talk about them later. But you got Alabama, you got Auburn. I'm really high on Auburn. Mississippi State, who performed well, obviously, against LSU. I think Ole Miss is in that conversation. Right now, I think Arkansas is the worst team in the West, followed by LSU. Now that can change. That can certainly change. LSU may figure things out week 4, week 5. That's fine. These rankings can change. But right now, Arkansas's got to be the worst team in the West, followed by LSU. I would have Ole Miss as the third worst team, and then I think I would slide A&M right there in the middle. And the top 3 would be Mississippi State, Auburn, and Alabama, or I guess you could switch Auburn and Alabama if I were ranking this, because I think Auburn right now is the better team. I think they would beat Alabama if they played this weekend. Either way, the point of all this discussion is that Texas A&M right now is just riding in the middle of the pack. They're riding in the middle of the pack in the West, which, yes, is the better division in the SEC, but that's not why they hired Jimbo Fisher. They didn't pay this man $75 million to be in the middle of the pack. And, your schedule is brutal, right? It's brutal. I mean, you got Alabama on the road this weekend. You got Florida at home. Then you got Mississippi State on the road. If they perform like they did against Vanderbilt, I could see them losing all 3 of those games. And then you're sitting at 1-3 with 3 more right now ranked teams left on the schedule. Tennessee, LSU, and Auburn. I would say only Auburn really in those teams should be ranked. But you're going to have a second half of the schedule that's, it's a lot easier to digest, but you're already, 3 losses in? Your conference championship hopes are done, dashed. And if you drop, let's say 2 of those games, right? Let's say they lose to Alabama and Florida, somehow are able to take down Mississippi State on the road. It's probably going to be a close matchup. You'll still be a 2-loss team. You're likely going to lose to Auburn. I think, South Carolina right now has a lot of issues, but they always seem to upset a team that they really have no business beating. They did this to Georgia not too long ago. So that game's on the road. The Tennessee game is on the road for the Aggies. They have Ole Miss. I mean, there is potential here. There is potential for them to drop a game that they otherwise may overlook. So the point of all this is to say they could, right now I see them best case scenario they're going to finish 7-3, and I think more than likely it's going to be 6-4, and if it's really not good, it's going to be 5-5. And when you unpack that, 7-3, nobody's really going to complain. You lose to Alabama, you lose to Florida, and you lose to Auburn, I don't think you're going to get many complaints from people. You go 6-4, people are going to be like, they just kind of have this bad taste in their mouth, right? They're just, it wasn't a horrible season, but it really wasn't a good one either. And then if you go 5-5, which that's contingent on you lose to Alabama, you lose to Florida, you lose to Mississippi State, you lose to Auburn, and then let's say Tennessee beats you. Although I think South Carolina or Ole Miss has as good a chance, but let's just pretend that Tennessee is the team that gives the Aggies their 5th loss. You're sitting at 5-5, and I don't think the fan base is really going to be too happy with you. And you're already in your 3rd year of I believe a 10-year contract. So at that point, where do you go as a program? You've got this guy, Jimbo. You've got him for 7 more years. how do you go forward, right? Not just with recruiting, but as you try and compete for SEC championships, which really has not happened for A&M. I would say really since the Manziel era. But again, if you're A&M and you look at the last few years, let's go back to last season. Let's go back to last season, right? Okay, so they had Clemson on the road in week 2, which they dropped that game 24-10. It was a relatively close game. It was a good game. It was a good pre-conference slate game. It wasn't ever really close. Never really felt like A&M was going to be potentially upsetting Clemson, but it was still a good game. I watched that game. It was still a good game. Auburn was a few weeks later. They lost that one 28-20. Not horrible. But then you go down to Alabama 2 weeks after that. They lost that 47-28. Now, between the Auburn-Alabama game, they played Arkansas and only beat them by 4 points. So, again, I could spend 30 minutes breaking down A&M's performance the last few seasons, but really what you need to know is that they've not been consistent. They've not been consistent against the cellar dwellers of the SEC. And when they're in big games, Clemson, Auburn, Alabama, Georgia, LSU at the time, they fall flat. They fall very flat. I mean, the performance against Alabama was not good. The performance against Clemson, it was not really close. I mean, the final score was a 14-point discrepancy, but A&M right now has not won a big game, really, since Jimbo has been there. And he's now in his 3rd season. So the reason I'm spending so much time talking about this is because, this matters, right? The outcome of not just the Alabama game, but really A&M's season is going to have ramifications, not just for Jimbo Fisher, but for the entire SEC West. Because if A&M starts to slip and they start to fall off, and, in a season or two, maybe they just decide, it's just not working with Jimbo. They either get rid of him, and then I don't know who you hire. But the point here is that if A&M slips, right? So let's say A&M continues to disappoint in these big games. Well, if you look at the broader SEC West, you have programs most of the programs are on the rise right now. Now, that can change, but right now you have Mike Leach, who's coming off a huge win against the defending national champions, which feels weird to say because LSU is so different from what they were last year that it's almost like I know that a lot of coaches say, oh, we're a completely different team. No, LSU is a completely different team this year. They're completely different. They're not even in the same zip code. It's just a complete restructuring and relaying of the foundation of that program. You have to accept that. I'm not ragging LSU because they lost everybody. When you lose everybody, you have to rebuild. And they lost everyone. And so it's going to take a while to figure things out. Now, maybe they will. I'm not optimistic, but this is college football. Anything could happen. Regardless, in terms of the impact on the SEC West for A&M, if A&M continues to drop off, I think you're going to see Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Auburn fill that void. And you may be sitting, in a couple of years, you may be sitting with Arkansas, unless something crazy happens. You may be sitting with Arkansas, A&M, and even maybe LSU kind of living near the bottom. Who knows? I mean, right now the balance of power. Maybe this is a better way of explaining it. The balance of power in the West is being turned on its head because everybody saw Alabama lose 2 conference games last season, and that really shook things up. Not just in college football, not just in the SEC, but in the SEC West. Because it's almost like you can tell, you can see it, you can feel it. It's palpable there is a opening for other teams to start to fill that potential. The door has been opened. Now, who's going to step in? Who's going to step across that threshold? Auburn right now is the closest to doing it. Auburn has the most pieces in place. They're coming off a great year last year. Bo Nix, sophomore season. But Auburn is in the pole position to take over the helm. If you'd asked me 2-3 weeks ago, I don't think Mississippi State or Ole Miss would have been in that conversation. Now, after their performances, respectively, against LSU and Florida, I think they are. Because A&M, Arkansas, and LSU have demonstrated that they're not ready yet. They're not ready yet. Auburn, Ole Miss, and Mississippi State have. Now, yeah, that Alabama still has to lose games, right? They still beat Missouri. It wasn't pretty, but they beat Missouri. But they have Georgia. They have Tennessee. They have Mississippi State. They have LSU. They have Auburn. They avoid Florida, who I think would beat them. I don't really know about Georgia. Georgia has a lot of issues on offense. That game is coming up between Alabama and Georgia. That is October 17th, and that will be at Alabama. So Alabama still needs to slip up. But again, after last season, I think you could tell there was this sense of, okay, maybe there is an opening here to, reorganize the pecking order. And we could be watching that in real time. So I think A&M really has to do more than they've been doing in big games in order to prevent this slippery slope becoming a free fall. And if they don't perform well against Alabama or Florida, I think there's going to be some serious questions about whether or not Jimbo Fisher's the right guy in College Station after this season. Because look, I mean, you talk about athletic budgets, you want to talk about resources. A&M has some of the best in the country. Some of the best. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they perform in this game against Alabama. And if they can figure out some of the issues that plagued them against Vanderbilt earlier this season. One of the biggest questions that we spent a couple of minutes here breaking down the actual matchup. I think one of the biggest things to look at is how many big plays can A&M manage on offense. They weren't very efficient. Didn't hold on to the ball very well against Vandy. But they had, a fair number of explosive plays. Now, yeah, that's against the Vandy defense. But you have to remember, in order to really challenge Alabama for 60 minutes, you need to have big plays. You need to be able to take out chunks of the field at one time. Sustaining long drives against Alabama for 4 quarters has historically been very difficult for teams to do. Like, maybe you can do it once, maybe they do it twice. But most of the time, the last, I'd say, decade or so, if you want to beat Alabama, you've got to just gash them on defense. I mean, just gash them. And then the other side of this is, can A&M's defense, which is pretty stout, they have a pretty stout defense, can they do what Missouri's could not? Alabama struggled a lot on first downs. They found themselves behind the chains a decent amount. But, Missouri wasn't ever really able to generate a lot of pressure on Alabama's quarterback. And so if A&M is able to be stout on first downs, put Alabama behind the chains, and then get to the quarterback, you could be looking at a lot of third and longs for Alabama. Which, again, if you go by the statistics, that's a good indication of a team that if they're not going to lose, it may be a very tight game if you put Alabama in a bunch of third and longs. Now, I think A&M has the defense to do what Missouri's could not, and I think A&M's offense has the talent to put together big chunk plays. But they need to be successful on first down. They need to stay ahead of the chains, and so we'll see. Right? I think it's going to be a really intriguing matchup. I think that Alabama will ultimately win this game. If you had to ask me how close it'll be, I feel like it'll probably be about a 2-touchdown differential. I really don't think Alabama's going to run away with this one. And A&M's already shown that they can score, with obviously the big plays on offense and the efficiency there. So I think even if Alabama starts to score and put some points up on the board, A&M can match it. I have this gut feeling that there's going to be one quarter where Alabama just shuts A&M down. Could be the second quarter, could be the third quarter, but they're just going to shut A&M down. A&M will compete. It'll be really close, and then we'll go into that quarter, and Alabama will score 14, 17 points, and then A&M won't be able to catch back up. They'll be toe-to-toe for the rest of the game, but then that one quarter, that'll be the difference, that 15 minutes of football. And then I think, honestly, that Florida will probably beat A&M worse than Alabama. Because, again, Florida has just been very impressive so far this season, especially on offense. Now, defense, they do have a lot of questions. A lot of questions on defense for Florida. But I still think even if it's a shootout between A&M and Florida, I would favor Florida in that matchup. Maybe a little closer than a blowout, but it'll still favor Florida. Okay, let's take a break. Next up on the slate, we're going to talk about Auburn and their matchup against Georgia this weekend, and if that stands between them and a college football playoff berth. That is next. You don't want to miss it. Stick around. Welcome back to the show. Again, you are listening to After Further Review. I'm Jay Smith. Appreciate you tuning in, whether it's podcast form, listening on any of the podcast platforms. We're actually available, I believe, on 7 or 8 different platforms now, or watching on Facebook. Always appreciate you tuning in. Second part of the show, we're going to talk about the really intriguing matchup this weekend between Georgia and Auburn, and what this means for both teams. Now, look, Auburn had their performance against Kentucky, who was ranked 23rd. They were a little slow in the first half of that game. They ended up taking care of business pretty handily. Weren't a lot of questions there. I thought Bo Nix performed well. I think his O-line could have given him a little bit more protection. But overall, I don't think you can be too disappointed with the performance against a good Kentucky team. A good Kentucky team out of the SEC East. But with that being said, for Georgia and how they performed in their opening matchup against Arkansas, I kind of talked about this on a previous show. It wasn't pretty. I know it was 37-10 at the end of the game. When the final whistle sounded, but it was a 5-7 game going into the locker room, and that's with a safety for Georgia. So Arkansas was in command of the game. Well, I really shouldn't say that. They were leading the game. No one was in command of this game. This game was awful. I mean, it was just a awful performance by both teams in terms of just execution and management of the game. It was sloppy, and Georgia did turn it around in that third quarter and put up 22 points. It was really more of a result of Arkansas's incompetence than anything else. And Georgia has some serious questions right now. It's going to be, I think, a game that comes down to who makes the fewest mistakes. And that's typically what these kinds of games between two fairly evenly matched teams, that's what determines them, is who's going to make the fewest mistakes. Now, I've already talked about this a lot. Auburn, I think, is in the best position to replace, or fill in the void or whatever. I don't necessarily think Alabama's on their way out. I just think Auburn, after the season they had last year, after Bo Nix's performance, again, I've broken all this down. I think Auburn right now is a solid pick to win the West. And again, if they're able to get through Georgia, you look at their next few games, you got Arkansas, South Carolina, and Ole Miss. Now, barring a sudden development in either of those teams, looking at you, Ole Miss, I think Auburn gets through that slate mostly unchallenged. So you started off the season with a solid win, 29-13 over Kentucky. Georgia looks pretty shaky. And if you start 2-0, it's really easy to imagine that you could end up 5-0, which is, again, my take on Auburn, is that they understand what's at stake this season. They understand how slim the margin of error is. And they have the pieces in place to compete. And not just get to an SEC championship, but I think maybe win an SEC championship. I think I would lean towards Florida if it were today, but I think Auburn has the potential to make that a very interesting game. One of the key strengths right now for Auburn is their defense. Forced 3 turnovers against Kentucky. They had 8 tackles for loss. They gave up less than 4 yards per rush. And there was a pick 6 that was wiped off for I believe it was a personal foul penalty. But either way, the defense played well. They played well against Kentucky, and Georgia's offense, especially in the first half of that Arkansas game, it didn't look good. It wasn't fluid. It wasn't clean. There were a lot of mistakes. It was sloppy football. And if Auburn's on their game, they'll be able to take advantage of that. And it goes back to my original point. Who's going to make the fewest mistakes? Auburn didn't really make a lot of mistakes in their matchup against Kentucky. It took a while for them to distance themselves from the Wildcats on the scoreboard, but they really didn't make a ton of mistakes. Bo Nix played well. He's taken that experience of last season and it's put under his belt. Malzahn has already said he has confidence. He knows what being a leader's like. He knows what he wants. That's a direct quote. He knows what he wants. But another difference is Chad Morris, the former Clemson offensive coordinator guru, and then I think he went to SMU. I'm not sure if he's been anywhere in between SMU and Auburn. But look, his fingerprints are all over the Auburn offense. It was obvious with the routes the receivers were running. And the way that he used tight ends, I thought was really clever. In looking at some of the film from the Kentucky game, there was even a screen pass to a tight end, J.J. Peggy's. So he had a lot of creative schemes, and I think with Chad Morris kind of taking over that offensive role. And Bo Nix being a sophomore and still having time to learn and perfect and get better and mature, I think it bodes really, really well for Auburn in this matchup. Now, one of the things they still need to figure out on offense is their running game. That never really got into a rhythm during the Kentucky game, so there is still room for improvement. Auburn is not a perfect football team. So, still need to figure out some things on the ground. But the passing game was solid. And again, that speaks to a Chad Morris-led offense. That's something you typically would see. Now, it's important to note that Kentucky's defense last year was 20th in yards per game. Georgia was 3rd. So this defense didn't lose a lot of pieces, pretty stout. It's the offensive side of the ball for Georgia that's, the issue right now. Georgia has some pretty serious questions, I think, at the quarterback position. DeJuan Mathis was pulled in the second quarter in favor of Stetson Bennett. So there's a new coordinator there, Todd Monken, and obviously he's still trying to get everything figured out. But I will say it did not look like Georgia really knew what they were doing on offense against the Razorbacks. If anything, it looked like they were going backwards. So I think there's some serious questions for Georgia, and Auburn has more pieces in place and more figured out. So I really think that, and again, they understand the importance of this game, and they understand the importance of winning this game, because this is key, because Auburn didn't get there last year. Auburn got to the Outback Bowl, right? They lost 3 regular season games. They lost to, I believe it was Florida, Georgia, and LSU. Then lost to Minnesota. And they are hungry for a championship season. Not just Malzahn, Bo Nix, Chad Morris, all those. I mean, Chad Morris, this guy's a winner. He was a winner at Clemson. Didn't do so hot at SMU. But this game can determine momentum very early in the season for either program. And Auburn is most primed to receive it. So it's going to be a good game. I think it's going to be a must-watch game. I think it will be a close game. But I think ultimately Auburn will prevail. I could see it being about a 7 to 10 point difference in the final score. But in terms of going back to the original question, does a win at Georgia stand between Auburn and a college football playoff berth? I'd say yes. It's the first major hurdle. It's the first major hurdle for Auburn. And again, we talked about how their schedule for the next 3 weeks after is relatively manageable. With Arkansas, South Carolina, Ole Miss. We'll see what LSU looks like. And then you got Mississippi State, Tennessee, Alabama, and A&M. So not an easy finish. But again, if you establish that momentum, you win a big game, you're rolling into the second half of the season already, with the championship mindset. Every game is a qualifier to get to that championship. There's a difference in mindset. There's a difference in mindset between, losing a week 2, week 3, week 4 game and kind of having to cross your fingers, hope something happens, and win the rest of your games to get in, right? You're kind of on that outside. Like, even if they don't really say, oh, well, Auburn, they're out of the playoff discussion with that law. No one really says that, but it's the perception. And the flip of that is, if you win your game, you control your own destiny. Every game, whether it's a, quote, regular season game, doesn't really matter. It's a qualifier. It's a qualifier for a championship. It's a qualifier for a playoff berth. Unofficially. And that's essentially what a conference championship is. It's a quarterfinal. Is what it is. It's a quarterfinal. And this is your quote unquote bracket. This is your section of the bracket. It's your conference. And you have to win your bracket to make it to the Final Four. And that's what a quarterfinal game is. So Auburn wants to control their own destiny. In terms of the matchup, I think there's fewer questions on the Auburn side than the Georgia side. I think it'll be a really close game. And I think it'll be a good game. But I think the Tigers get it done, and I think they roll through their schedule and make some noise later in the season. All right, we're going to take one last break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up the show, preview some Week 2 matchups for the college pick'em season. That is next. Stick around. Welcome back to the show, final segment of today's AFR, looking at the Week 2 matchups for the college pick'em season. Some really interesting games, some interesting matchups are on the slate for this week, and I would say some games that were a little bit harder to pick than last week. Last week I felt like was pretty clear cut. There were a couple that were close. There were, I guess, toss-ups. I did fairly well. 8 out of 10. We had 3 other 8 out of 10s that tied for first. Gave them a shout out on the Instagram earlier this week. But I want to spend some time now talking about each of the matchups for the Week 2 pick'em season. First up on the slate, TCU and Texas. Now, I know what you're thinking, which is what most people are thinking. I want to say it's like 98% right now. I have picked Texas. Yes, you should pick Texas, but that doesn't mean this is going to be a blowout. Okay, Texas has repeatedly showcased their inability to play defense. They held UTEP to 3 points, but Texas Tech put up 56 and really should have won that game. TCU is coming off of a close loss to Iowa State in a game that really could have gone either way. Texas is obviously the more talented team. Texas is the team that is 2-0. They're still top 10. They went down in the rankings, I think, 1 or 2 spots this past week just because of their performance against Texas Tech. Not LSU. Texas they're 13-point favorites in this game. But I'll just say, in the Big Ten, the only thing that's certain is uncertainty. And I would not be surprised if TCU makes this game very close, very competitive. Remember, this is a TCU team that has beaten Texas in 5 of the last 6 years. Last season, they beat them 37-27. So this idea that, Texas is going to run all over TCU, I don't know why 98. It's the craziest thing when I look at these pick'em percentages. Why are 98% of people picking Texas? Does nobody think that TCU, a team that lost in a close game to Iowa State, stands a chance? I mean, yeah, they're 0-1, but that doesn't, good teams lose games. On the defensive side of the ball, though, Texas has, they're just embarrassing, which is actually the word that Coach Herman said in his press conference. Kind of called out Chris Ash, the defensive coordinator, a little bit. He said he said, I think our defensive coordinator is well aware, but I'm putting air quotes on that, well aware of the challenges, as well as, how poorly we played. So, obviously, there's a lot of issues there. But on the offensive side of the ball, you have to be pleased, right? The Longhorns have amassed 122 points, 55 first downs, over 1,100 yards of total offense, and they've got 16 offensive touchdowns. And they're averaging 61 points a game. So, yeah, we've only played 2 games, and yeah, one of them against UTEP, but the fact is that Texas has proven that they have a Big 12 offense. They have a Big 12 offense. TCU also has a Big 12 offense, but maybe they can't put up 60 points. I don't expect to see a lot of defense in this game. This is going to be like watching a video game. Score. I think Texas will pull off and pull away. But it's really shocking to see so few people give TCU any credit. I think there's a vast underestimation of TCU. They deserve a little bit more respect than that, especially after how Texas performed last week. So, either way, it should be a good game. Going with Texas in that matchup. Let's move on To a game we've really spent the first whole portion of the show talking about. That's Alabama and Texas A&M. I've already kind of given my prediction for that, so I'm not going to go in depth into that matchup. I think Alabama wins this game. Interestingly enough, this just blows my mind. There are more people in terms of percentage picking Texas A&M than TCU. So you got like 3 or 4% of people picking Texas A&M. You got like 2% of people picking TCU against their respective opponents. That just doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, we will move on to the first real toss-up game of this week's slate, and that is Memphis and SMU. Now, there's not a whole lot of talk about Memphis this season so far. Obviously, Mike Norvell is gone. He's at Florida State. And, I don't expect Memphis to be in any discussion for a playoff berth or anything of that nature. So this game's going to go under the radar. It's a game that kicks off on ESPN2 at 3:30. This is the game that if you are a fan of these teams, you're going to watch it. And if you're not, you're either going to not know it's on, or you're going to flip past ESPN2 and go, this is interesting. And it is going to be interesting. And it is going to be a good game. So you should watch it if, you want to flip on ESPN2. Here's the thing about Memphis. This is a team that's almost had a month off because of postponements and cancellations. This is a Memphis team that started their season with a win and then didn't get to play for a while. September 5th. It has been a month, people. It has been a month since they beat Arkansas State 37-24. They had to cancel games against Houston and UT San Antonio. So, Ryan Silverfield, who's the coach at Memphis now, said that a majority, that's a quote, a majority of his team is back, and he's confident the players are in a good spot to play. But they're going to be rusty. I mean, that's an obvious question. Like, how rusty are you going to be when you haven't played a football game in a month? I mean, that's almost unprecedented. When is the last time we've had a regular season where a team has gone nearly a month between games? That is a ridiculously long layoff. Now, Silverfield, Memphis' coach, he tried to play that down and say, listen, we just focus on fundamentals. That'll knock the rust off. Sure. That's as good a strategy as I've heard. Take care of the football, that kind of stuff. Don't get behind the chains on first down. That kind of the fundamentals. SMU coach, though, Sonny Dykes, is going to have a hard time getting a read on this Memphis team because he hasn't seen them play. There's not a lot of film. But look, Memphis has won the last 3 matchups in this game between these two schools. But SMU has momentum and they have rhythm, and they've played well so far this season. They're coming off of a 50-7 rout of Stephen F. Austin last week, and they've played 3 games. They've had no cancellations of any kind. I'm sorry, it was the TCU game. The TCU game was postponed, so I correct myself there. The TCU game was postponed, so they only had 1 postponement. But in each of their games, they've looked really, efficient. Texas State at North Texas, and then SF Austin. Yes, SF Austin. So I think that SMU is, and again, this game could really go either way, but I think that SMU, because they've had more experience with this season, they're not coming off a month layoff, I think they're the safer pick. Now, I will tell you, right now, it is slightly edged for Memphis. It's like 51-49. I mean, it is dead even. It's a toss-up game. But I think SMU will get this done. It'll be close. Should be really close. Should be an interesting game. Should be a game that's under the radar, right? We talked about it a minute ago. It's under the radar. You flip it on, you go, oh, this is interesting. Ends up being a great matchup. So definitely tune into that one if you can. Next up, we got Oklahoma and Oklahoma State and Kansas. Now, about the same percentage of people are picking Oklahoma State as are people picking Alabama. But here's the reality. Oklahoma State's going to win this game because they're playing Kansas. But the fireworks that Oklahoma State had planned for their offense this season, they have not materialized. There's just not been a lot of offensive production from Oklahoma State, a team that beat West Virginia 27-13 and beat Tulsa 16-7. Serious questions right now in Stillwater. Serious questions. I mean, a lot of issues on the offensive side of the ball. Defensively, it's pretty impressive, right? So far, we've only had one Big 12 game to judge it off of, and in Kansas, that's not exactly the best measuring stick. But holding West Virginia to 13 points, I thought was a good performance defensively. They have Baylor after this. Oklahoma State does on the road. Then they have Iowa State. Texas is the real test, and that is on Halloween. Oklahoma State wins this game. Doubt it's close. More interested to watch to see what they do differently on offense and if they improve at all. Because this is what this is. This is a tune-up conference game. This is a tune-up game. And if they come out and they fall flat and they look flat against Kansas, it's going to raise very serious questions. Very serious. I would be surprised to see them drop. So I think Oklahoma State gets it done. But, check the box score. See how they did on offense. If you're into that kind of thing. Next up, we got an ACC matchup. We got North Carolina and Boston College. This is a game that's going to kick off at 3:30 on ABC. And, again, talk about a team that has a long hiatus. UNC, a 3-week hiatus. A team that started off by winning their opener against Syracuse in pretty convincing fashion, 31-6. Obviously, the Charlotte game was canceled. So now this is their second game of the season at Boston College. So I think a lot of people are just penciling in North Carolina because they see that 12 next to their name, but rust is a real thing. And Chestnut Hill is not always an easy place to play. It's a long trip. That's a long way to go from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, to Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. I had to think about Massachusetts. So North Carolina's going to need to get things cranked up again. I think this is going to be a slow, sloppy first half. It may even be scoreless. North Carolina will pick it up in the second half. I think they'll pull away, maybe win by 10 or 14 points. I'm picking the Tar Heels in this matchup. But that doesn't mean you can underestimate Boston College, a team that knows how to kick it into gear and win games. And they've demonstrated that this season with wins against Duke and Texas State. But I think in this matchup, North Carolina, a more talented team. It may take them a while, but if you're North Carolina, you can afford to have a slow first half against a team like Boston College. Clemson, no. Miami, no. So North Carolina gets this one done. All right, next matchup we got is Ole Miss and Kentucky. Switching back to the SEC now. Two teams that are trying to rebound. Two teams that are coming off of losses. Ole Miss coming off a loss to Florida. Kentucky's coming off a loss to Auburn. And you really got to wonder, what sort of hangover will be lingering in the air for either of these teams. Kentucky was a team that started off, ranked. Obviously, they had a little bit of higher expectations, I'd say, than Ole Miss. That was just 23rd, but they didn't really play very well against Auburn. I was impressed with Ole Miss's performance against Florida. I thought a 51-35 score was something to be moderately happy with. I mean, I don't think anybody was surprised by the 51 points that Florida put up, but I was surprised by the 35 points that Ole Miss put up. I was expecting it to be in the mid-20s. Now, you can't ignore the fact that Florida put up a school record 642 yards against Ole Miss. But, Kentucky isn't Florida in terms of offense. So I don't think Kentucky's going to set a school record for total yards against Ole Miss. But Kiffin acknowledged in his press conference this week there's some questions. There's some questions on the defensive side of the ball that we need to address. And so, in terms of this matchup, obviously Kentucky, Ole Miss, they've played 5 times since 2005. Ole Miss holds a 3-2 advantage in those matchups. This game is going to be at Kentucky. I want to say Matt Corral for Ole Miss is going to be the starting quarterback over John Rice Plumlee. We'll see. Thought Corral played really well in the game against Florida. He was 22 for 31, 395 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 pick. Elijah Moore was his primary target. 10 catches, 227 yards. Good stuff out of the offense for the Ole Miss Rebels. So, Kentucky, again, on the other side of this matchup, Kentucky outgained Auburn, 384 to 324. But the offense stalled in the second half, and they committed 3 turnovers. They had that slippery football syndrome. So, based off of the consistency that Ole Miss displayed throughout all 4 quarters against Florida, yeah, they were down, but they never quit. They never stopped moving the ball, scoring, and showing that they were in the fight. Kentucky just kind of fell off against Auburn. So based off of those performances, I think this game could be either way. I think it's basically a coin flip kind of game. I think Ole Miss wins this one. I think Ole Miss wins this game. It'll do a lot for their confidence winning a game on the road. I think Kentucky continues to kind of slide as their season becomes even more derailed. And I think this is a good opening win in the Lane Kiffin era for the Ole Miss Rebels. So I'm going with Ole Miss in this matchup. All right, next up we got Navy and Air Force. Again, a game that most people probably won't necessarily be tuning into. This kicks off at 6 p.m. on the CBS Sports Network. Not much to say about this matchup besides the fact that Air Force does have a few personnel questions in terms of being able to travel to Navy. Obviously, the Air Force is based out in Colorado, and Navy is in Maryland. But it's important to note that Air Force has won 8 consecutive games going back to last season. That's the longest active winning streak in the nation, tied with Notre Dame. They actually lead the all-time series against Navy, 30-22. But there is something to say about the fact that Navy's already played 2 games this season. They should have an advantage because of that. And, setting aside that pounding they received from BYU on September 7th, they lost that one 55-3. They, recognized they weren't prepared for that game, came back, played well. In part of the... Well, okay, so let me say this about Navy. They looked awful against BYU, right? They lost 55-3. They did beat Tulane, 27-24. I did say a second ago that they looked great against Tulane. They did not in the first half, obviously. They were shut out in the first half. It was 24-0 going into the locker room. However, they showed a remarkable resiliency in their comeback, which started about halfway through the third quarter. It was about 7 minutes left in the third quarter before Navy finally put some points up on the board. And then they just blitzed their way to a 27-24 victory. And that kind of performance in one half can really change how a team perceives themselves. Do I think that this was a great performance by Navy for 60 minutes? No, I don't. They didn't play well for the first half at all. But what they did in the second half had the potential to really galvanize them and show them, hey, look, we're a team that can bounce back even from a 24-point deficit. And so I think that alone, that experience in that game could be the difference in this matchup between Navy and Air Force. So I'm going to pick the midshipmen in this matchup. I think this will be a pretty close game. I mean, again, Navy has shown remarkable inconsistency. They've really only played one good half of football. They've played 4 halves of football, and only one has been decent. So I know that I'm kind of going out on a limb here, but it's one more good half of football than we've seen from Air Force. So unless somebody else has something out there that they think sheds more insight into this matchup, I'd love to hear it. But right now, I'm going to pick the midshipmen. All right, 3 games left. We've got Auburn at Georgia. I actually spent the second part of the show breaking down this matchup. I've got the Tigers. I'm going with the Auburn Tigers in this matchup. That is in the minority. Right now, it's about 33% Auburn, 66% Georgia. I'm sticking with my Tigers. I think they get it done. It'll be a close game, but I think Auburn will eventually emerge victorious. Oklahoma and Iowa State. This game is, I think, a safe pick for Oklahoma. I don't see them having a lot of issues in this matchup. They are obviously looking to rebound after their loss to Kansas State, 38-35. Shocking fashion, too. You want to talk about a shocking ending to a game. That Kansas State-Oklahoma game was just, I just could hardly wrap my head around it. How they managed to let Kansas State get back into that game when they seemingly had it under wraps. Either way, I think they get this game done against Iowa State. Rattler looked rattled against Kansas State, but I think Oklahoma still has a lot to play for. You can't ignore the fact they've won 5 consecutive conference titles. They've reached the college football playoff for 3 consecutive seasons, but all that's kind of in doubt now. And so you really, you want to pay attention to this game to see how they respond. All those streaks are kind of in doubt after that 38-35 shocker to Kansas State. Interesting little nugget here was the first September loss for the Sooners since Lincoln Riley replaced Bob Stoops as head coach in 2007. So it's been a long time since Oklahoma tasted a defeat early in the season. And so this is going to be a really telling matchup to see how they respond. Is there a hangover? How is this going to affect not just Rattler but the whole roster? Iowa State's a formidable opponent in terms of the Big 12, but I still think Oklahoma, if they stick to fundamentals, if they don't come out and just lay an egg for the first 2 or 3 quarters, I think they win this game. I think they win this game fairly handily. I think it gives them they restore their confidence a little bit, and I think they get it done. So I'm going to go with the Sooners in this matchup. All right, last game on the slate. You got Mississippi State and Arkansas. Arkansas, worst team in the SEC right now. Mississippi State coming off a win against the defending national champions. Air raid offense looked mighty efficient. I think Mississippi State moves to 2-0. I think Mike Leach continues to impress in the SEC, and I don't think this game will be very close. We'll see, though. I mean, it's college football. Crazier things have happened. But based off of what we saw last week from Mississippi State, I think they stand a good chance to beat Arkansas, make some noise around the conference. So, yeah, that's the slate of matchups for Week 2 of the College Pick'em season. Again, congrats to the 3 guys that were tied for first after Week 1 with 8 out of 10 picks correct from last week. Yeah, we're out of time, though. That's it for this edition of After Further Review. I appreciate you tuning in, joining me, whether it's through the podcast or watching on Facebook. And we'll be back for a breakdown of the Week 5 action on Tuesday with the Tuesday show. And we'll keep things rolling. So appreciate you tuning in. And I'm Jay Smith, and this has been After Further Review.